Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. We're super excited to see so many people from around the world tuning in to us. My name is Becca Schmidt, and I am a client account manager for Black & Veatch's Power Business and your Q&A host for today. So hopefully you have all had the chance to download our latest report on the electric industry. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our strategic directions series, every year, we send out surveys to industry leaders around the globe to draw their insights onto immediate and long-term market needs facing the power industry. If you haven't downloaded the report yet, we'd like you to do so and go ahead and visit bv.com/reports to download the report. This year's report talks about how rapid evolution to repower the power sector has been hastened by the rising tide of renewable and distributed energy and the challenges and opportunities that come with it. So that's our main topic for today. And we've got three of the report's authors on the line with us, which we're really excited about. Rob Wilhite, he is the director of Global Distributed Energy Business. We've got Deepa Podaval, the strategic advisory leader in our management consulting business, and Jason Rowell, who will be joining us in a bit from our global technology group. He is our global technology portfolio manager. So to all of you guys on the line, please feel free to send in your questions through the chat window. We'll do our best to get as many of them as we can answered today. So to go ahead and kick things off, we've posted a poll question to our followers on Twitter and LinkedIn and asked what they considered the biggest challenge facing the electric industry. The responses definitely mirrored our report results. Aging infrastructure remains the chief focus area, with integrating renewables coming at a close second. So, Rob, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not too surprised, Becca. One of the things that we are doing a lot of is working with utilities to help replace some of that aging infrastructure, whether it's transmission distribution infrastructure, it's repowering central station generation, or it's installing new distributed energy resources to ultimately replace some of the capacity that will be retired in the future and now in the future as it relates to conventional generation. So yeah, no real surprises there. In fact, it's interesting to see that this is really prevalent as a high priority for utilities all around the world based on the survey results we're seeing today. So no real surprise.
Absolutely. And to your point, there are so many ways that we're able to upgrade our aging infrastructure, whether it's through retrofit work or through new projects that are to replace the old existing infrastructure. So the next question I'm going to throw out is to you, Deepa. In the age of COVID, do you see the dynamic between utilities and regulators changing at all?
Hi, Becca, and welcome everyone. We're so happy you were able to join us. Yes, absolutely. I think it's a very challenging time across the industry, across all of the different stakeholders. Driven by COVID, regulators took some actions, utilities took some actions, but essentially some of what has happened is that utility rules for bad debt, late payments, etc., have been waived to allow continuation of service, understanding the hardships that are being felt across the economy. Now that has consequences, although everyone agrees it's the right thing to do now. What it does is it creates regulatory assets and unearned revenues that need to be recovered. So it will be interesting to see how that evolves next year. Because there is some degree of rate fatigue and affordability issues. But at the same time, these are, approved costs for which the utilities have been allowed to earn returns. And, how and when that will play itself out, when they will be able to amortize some of these unearned assets that they're gathering will make for an interesting year.
Absolutely. I think we have a lot of big things to see coming up within the next year. One of the viewers live with us today has asked a question. Ernst has asked, "How do HDVC systems work?" And I'm going to throw this one to you, Rob.
To put the acronym in terms of the transmission, high voltage DC transmission circuits, is what I'm assuming out of this. So hopefully that's the right path I'll take right here. So, in order to talk about how an HVDC system works, it's going to take us a lot more than the hour we have scheduled here today. But let me just generally say that HVDC is a very common way of transmitting high voltage power across great distances as compared to high voltage AC transmission. HVDC transmission results in fewer losses in terms of the energy that dissipates as heat. And it also enables us to travel much longer distances for a lower cost in some cases too. Now, generally HVDC systems will have greater expense associated with them, both in terms of capital upfront, as well as the operating expense. But some of that is made up on the ability to transmit large-scale energy across great distances. So, for example, there are great hydropower projects in places like Brazil or in China, but yet the load centers that demand that energy are many hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles away in some cases. So HVDC is a perfect technology and solution in order to transmit the energy from the source at the hydroelectric dam into the load centers where the cities are located, generally along the coastlines. And so you're finding that HVDC projects are starting to gain increased interest here in the US as we look at opportunities to build large utility scale renewables projects, as an example, in the Midwest parts of our country, and perhaps transmitting that energy and that power into the large cities that are outside of the Midwest zone, perhaps in other states across on the East Coast of Mid-Atlantic, or even on the West Coast of the US. I know there's projects in New York State, for example, looking to bring power 200 to 300 miles away from upstate New York, where land is less expensive in terms of building large-scale wind or solar farms, and in transporting that power for several hundred miles through HVDC technology into New York City, where the energy is greatly needed in order to clean up the environmental footprint of how electricity is sourced in New York City today. So those are just a few examples and a very high-level overview of HVDC. The technicalities of how it operates and the conversions and the costs, we can save that for another conversation, but we do have additional folks within Black and Veatch who'd love to talk about that topic for a long time. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd like to give everyone a reminder to feel free to reach out to us and post any questions that you might have, and take advantage of the live experts we have here to answer those questions for you. So the next one that I have is for you, Jason. Where do you see the future of hydrogen in the energy mix? I know that's a pretty broad question, but if you could go ahead and break down to the best of your ability where you see the future of hydrogen going.
Yeah, one of the reasons so many people are excited about hydrogen is that it's such a broad value chain that crosses over many, many sectors and many, many industries. It can be used for power generation through fuel cells, through turbines, through engines. It can be used for green chemicals and decarbonizing a lot of industries that are otherwise hard to decarbonize, from concrete to steel making to methane reforming. And there's so many different types of hydrogen. Yesterday, I heard about a new color for the first time myself in pink hydrogen, which is defined as hydrogen generated from nuclear power. There's gray hydrogen, which is just the standard reforming of natural gas. Brown hydrogen, which is the reforming of coal. Blue hydrogen, which is reforming of coal or natural gas, capturing the carbon such that you have a really low carbon index fuel. And then there's green, which there's actually many different ways to make green hydrogen, whether it's gasification of biogas, which can even be considered carbon negative, to generation through electrolysis, with renewables, nuclear power, and hydroelectric power. So we see hydrogen having a strong play across, when we say our energy mix, looking at all sectors, from green chemicals, ammonia, methanol. Ammonia is a great transportation fuel that can take hydrogen around the world and then again use it in chemicals as fuel, as for power generation. And it's really the most powerful in the power sector as energy storage. And through hydrogen, you can take projects like Intermountain Power that we're working on, and you can capture solar power in the summer, wind power in the winter. You can store gigawatts and gigawatt hours worth of electricity, energy at low cost, and then take that back to electricity and send it down the wires when you need it.
Absolutely. I know one of the questions that we had a survey on in our strategic directions report discussed what all of the utilities breakdown of what they thought the highest investment for hydrogen use was. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts on that. So the highest investment was towards fuel cell storage, and some people said they weren't even going to invest in hydrogen at this point. Middle tier investments were in transportation fuel and peak generation, with some of the lower investments being in backup power and baseload generation, and just overall integrating it into existing facilities to making a plant greener. Jason, what do you feel? What are your thoughts on the breakdown that the survey concluded in the strategic directions report? Do you feel like that's a true reflection of where the market is headed?
Yeah, that's really the breakdown that we're seeing in practice in the industry. We're starting to see quite a bit of investment in the power industry. A lot of those projects are at a demonstration level, with utilities making that early mover to start generating hydrogen for decarbonization. And then we're seeing that grow up into huge projects like Intermountain Power that are going to start out at 30%. We're seeing Long Ridge Energy Center, which is going through and starting to make a larger conversion on GE plants. We've seen NextEra announce that they're going to put in 20 plus megawatts at Okeechobee and move forward. So those bigger projects are happening, but there's so much strength around the transportation industry right now, because you can realize a higher value for the hydrogen. There's subsidies in play. When you look globally, ammonia is becoming a hot commodity because countries like Japan, which is transferring itself into being a hydrogen society, they want to import hydrogen, liquid hydrogen. It's very difficult. The infrastructure is not there. Ammonia fills that gap. So really, for it to take off in every sector in the way we hope, it's going to need subsidies, the way that we saw around battery energy storage, we saw around solar, and we saw around wind. And if you look at where those technologies were 5, 10, 15 years ago, and look at what's happened today, where solar and wind can be the lowest cost power produced, and it can be some of the lowest cost energy. Hydrogen can certainly take that same path in the next decade as companies are starting to invest, starting to scale. And then once we start to see governments put in some tax credits and subsidies around that, we can see it just really take off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one final question regarding specifically hydrogen that's come in. What are your thoughts on distributed generation hydrogen type opportunities?
We see hydrogen as a distributed fuel. This thought about it as a centralized generating hydrogen, sent it out on pipelines or trucks, that's really not how it's going to play out in the future. It's going to be distributed type generation of hydrogen closer to where you want to have your end users. And it scales great from smaller plants to larger plants. So certainly using it on the generation side, there's going to be a lot of options there. There's a lot of ways to take distributed generation, decarbonize it through distributed hydrogen production very close to your endpoint. And so that's some of the most promising areas we see right now.
Absolutely. All right, answering another live question that was posted in the comments. Wind turbines are a big effect and affect the landscape, and it depends on the type of wind. So solar requires a very big area and also depends on the sun. What can be done to be a real replacement of renewables and gas? What is happening with hydrogen? What's happening with the reuse of COs after combustion in gas turbines? Rob, I don't know if you would be able to help answer this question that came in from our live audience.
Yeah, let me start with an initial reaction. I'll defer over to Jason for more discussion around hydrogen aspects of this. But one of the things we're seeing with large scale or even small scale solar and wind projects is introducing the notion of storage with those projects. And the combination in particular of solar plus storage is coming in at very affordable prices now. So handling the intermittency makes a lot of sense in order to store the energy for subsequent use during the peak times that may misalign with the peak production times of the renewable source itself. We also have to, as far as the replacement of renewables and gas, we have to also give our friends in the hydro industry a bit of a nod too, because there's certainly a tremendous amount of storage available through hydroelectric systems, both here in the US, in particular in Canada, and other places around the world for that matter. And so, we don't want to discount the notion that hydro storage is certainly available as a resource option for us in the future. And of course, as Jason touched on a few minutes ago, green hydrogen production, which really can come from off-peak use of renewables that have either been displaced as a result of the need to already meet the loads during the peak times during the day, and we've got excess wind at night, for example, or we simply want to discharge batteries if it makes sense to do so economically in order to operate electrolyzers in order for the production of hydrogen. And maybe I'll tee that over to Jason to complete some of that thought as well.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. So I'm looking at the question, what can be the real replacement of renewables and gas? Renewables can have a huge portion of our generation mix, and really gas enables that to happen. When you look at gas plants, gas turbine combined cycles, they can ramp at hundreds of megawatts a minute up and down. And as long as you have a fuel in the pipeline, you have limitless energy storage. And what's happening with hydrogen going forward over the long term is replacing natural gas or helping pull out some of that carbon in an effective way, such that you have energy storage that can enable further adoption of renewables into the grid up to an extremely high percentage. The reuse of COs, I'm going to assume that means, the reuse of the carbon oxides that we're seeing coming out of a combustion turbine. And that's going around carbon capture and blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen, again, is the reforming of natural gas before you put it into a gas turbine to pull those carbons out. You take CH4 and you essentially make H2 hydrogen, and then carbon dioxide, which you then capture and sequester or utilize. Carbon capture on the back end of a turbine, you're just taking it in a bigger stream to capture. But we're starting to see a lot of utilization come into play, from production of carbon nanotubes to fish food to what would be defined as blue chemicals, which is taking that captured CO2 and making hydrocarbon end products that people would use by taking that CO2 out of the atmosphere and being able to put it into permanent storage. So we're pretty excited about that.
Awesome. Fielding another live question that just came in. We've seen the slow downturn of the nuclear market over the last decade or two. And one of the audience questions was, what needs to happen in order to revitalize the nuclear industry? Rob, could you go ahead and give me your thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me start, and again, I'll pass over to Jason because I think we might have some mutually aligned thoughts on this. One of the things that I think that is expected to really advance nuclear energy in this country, if not around the world, is SMRs, small modular reactors. And if we can use that kind of technology, if it's sufficiently advanced, we can address the question of affordability, which is a big risk or a big unknown as it relates to investing in nuclear power today. Not to mention also the waste disposal issue, but at least on the affordability part of it, the U.S. Department of Energy and other entities are working to advance this technology to a point where we can at least de-risk some of the affordability and volatility of costs that are coming up in some of the economic analysis around the world right now. And I think that that's something that we'll keep an eye on very closely over the coming years. So, Jason, over to you.
Yeah, we're really excited about the revitalization of nuclear. Over the next decade, you're going to see a lot of developments, and you're going to start to see these plants going commercial, I think, at a fairly steady rate in the 2030s. So as Rob mentioned, SMRs, we're going from these huge 1,600 megawatt plants that cost $15 billion a piece with finance to build to something that's much more palatable to finance. So you're getting down in the 50 to 300 megawatt range, and you're getting to projects that are less than $1 billion that you can put into a lot of different locations. You can scale up as needed. A lot of those early SMRs that we're going to see are light water reactors, very similar to the older technologies, but they're going to have passive safe features. But what's really coming up, and what the DOE just got behind with their advanced reactor development program and funding, is really looking towards those Gen 4 reactors. Gen 4 reactors are going to be inherently safe. They won't be able to physically melt down. So you don't need the same level of passive cooling systems to account for that. They're going to use liquid sodium, liquid metals as a coolant, and you'll be able to make those much cheaper. They're going to be operating at lower pressures. You won't need as heavy a component, so affordability is going to come into play much more. And they're also going to be much more flexible in how they operate while operating at high temperatures that are going to allow thermolysis of hydrogen and to be able to produce that much cheaper too. So nuclear has a definite role in, I think, net zero power by 2050 around the world. This decade is going to have the big advances. The next decade is going to start to see the big growth in installations.
All right, bringing in another question we've received from the audience. How can we encourage governments, states, and county leaders to convert 100% of all organic waste, byproducts, and sustainable energy crops into biomethane to be injected locally into natural gas grids to increase the green credentials of the natural gas, not as a replacement to other technologies, but to work in partnership with other green technologies? Deepa, what are your thoughts on that one?
Sure, Becca. For any technology to sort of reach scale, which is what we're talking about here, you need a combination of two things to happen. One is you need regulatory support, and often here in the US at least, we've seen that become the precursor of the technology improving, costs coming down, where the economics catch up. We've seen that, renewables, solar, wind, increasingly now battery storage. So there is a role for governments and regulators to play here, just in terms of creating the right frameworks and mandates that allow some of this conversion of organic waste to happen, even when the economic hurdles can't always be overcome. And then the other side of it is you need ultimately the industry and the utilities to adopt and embrace these developments. Across the US at least, we're seeing a significant number of gas utilities actively look at renewable natural gas in some form or fashion. They all have a pilot program. The volumes are still fairly low, but the gas utilities do see this as a way of embracing their role in a greener future. As fossil fuel usage decreases through time, they do recognize that their existing infrastructure has value and are looking for ways to utilize that infrastructure and play a role within this carbon-free transition. So I think we will see increasingly more programs that allow, the creation of biogas in all of its different forms. There are, of course, practical issues related to the intermingling of RNG with natural gas, especially as the volumes increase. But those are just the steps that the industry needs to work through.
Absolutely. All right, Rob, this one, I'm going to start with you. What fringe storage options do you think may go mainstream? Non-lithium batteries, other options of that nature? And can you speak about short-term storage impact on VARs or power quality?
Yeah, I think we've been talking about so-called fringe options right now. Hydrogen is certainly one of those.
Right.
And, we ought to be thinking about hydrogen both in terms of power availability through perhaps fuel cells attached to buildings, but also fuel cell driven transportation. And in fact, we are at Black & Veatch pretty much involved in a lot of the advances associated with building a network of fuel cell cars fueling infrastructure in the state of California. One of the first states to actually have widespread availability in terms of the hydrogen availability to refuel fuel cell driven vehicles. And I think as we start to see those options emerge, I don't want to call them fringe any longer because they become part of the mainstream in a lot of cases, as long as we can make the economics work. I also mentioned hydro. Hydro storage is certainly a non-lithium or non-battery type storage, and we're not totally addressing all of the capacity that might be available to us through hydro. And I'm sure some of the folks on the call today are certainly involved in the hydro industry in many parts of the world. And then I think about alternative battery chemistries. And companies like Tesla, I'm a big fan of Tesla because of the transformation they have driven both in the transportation industry, but also in energy, in that they are specifically looking for new ways of changing the chemistry of lithium batteries today, especially getting away from things like cobalt, which comes from places around the world which are not really the best places in which we want to do business, nor do they have good labor practices in extracting things like cobalt. And so, we're looking to continue the R&D to advance some of these battery technologies. And I get an email almost daily now on some of the university-driven kind of research that we're seeing around alternatives to lithium-ion batteries. It's just a matter of, okay, which one of these are going to ultimately scale and to drive the economics that would help put a replacement and take it away from the fringe category and make it mainstream. So keep an eye on all of these various forms. And by the way, let's not forget about thermal energy storage, which has been around for many years in terms of building envelope materials, in terms of building ice storage for the use of chilling water during the day and during the peak times when we can keep the chillers off the grid during the peak hours of the day. And this is technology that is still in existence for many of us, and certainly still has viable economics depending on the building type and the operations. So those are just some various options, some of which may be called fringe or certainly are on the fringe of being mainstream.
Absolutely. Lots of new technologies coming up in the space to help drive the growth that we're going to be seeing in the storage market here within the next several years. With the accelerated deployment of distributed generation, do you expect a change to the power industry playground with new stakeholders? So municipalities, developers, EV operators, facility managers, et cetera. Do we see them taking a more significant role from the utilities? And what will it be? Deepa, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think the short answer is yes. What we think of as industry has changed so much. It's a much broader spectrum of participants beyond the traditional generator, transmission, distribution, and end user list. Today we have, many more CNIs, developers, even folks like logistics companies all become significant players in the electric industry. We do see this trend continue, and for these sort of non-traditional electric industry players to take a growing role in the industry. Here in the U.S., FERC had a pretty significant order come out in September, FERC Order 2222, which now allows distributed energy resources to play in the wholesale market. Again, that opens up a significant window of opportunity for a number of players in that DER space, going all the way from battery storage to energy efficiency, demand response, to aggregate together and begin to play not just in the retail markets, but in the wholesale markets as well. So, as we go forward, the industry is forming new rules, and this is where people like FERC, people like the RTOs and ISOs are still defining the market mechanisms that will create the rules of engagement between these various stakeholders. And increasingly, I think we'll see the utility become more, the conductor of the orchestra rather than the producer of the music itself.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone, for all of your questions coming up thus far. Another one that we've fielded. Do you see any future industry in removing carbon from methane to produce hydrogen, such as proton conduction or liquid metal reactors? Jason, I'm going to throw this one to you.
Yes, we absolutely see a future industry in removing carbon from methane to produce hydrogen. In fact, that's the blue hydrogen concept, is that you're going to put it through reformers, and there's various different processes to do that. It actually, capturing the CO2 is much more affordable than if you're trying to do it post combustion, because you have a much more concentrated stream when you go reform methane to CO2. So there is a lot of companies that have a lot of infrastructure, both in the ground and above the ground, around natural gas. And that is really one of the lowest cost paths to clean hydrogen, is through reforming methane. That price is about 1/4 to 1/5 the cost of green hydrogen right now. And it frees up those renewables to go do other things besides producing an energy storage. So we see it growing. Around the second part of the question, we do see a lot of research going into membranes as part of that CO2 capture technology. We're moving well past the older amine type CO2 capture to get there. And on liquid metal reactors, in fact, one of the technologies approved through the DOE's latest funding to develop new reactors was liquid sodium. And we do see that Gen 4 mix, it's going to be built around liquid metal cooled reactors. That's what's going to start to go forward in the next decade.
And talking a little bit more about Gen 4, what do you think about the idea of using depleted uranium, Jason?
Great question. There are absolutely going to be reactors, and there's reactors now that can use depleted uranium. There's reactors in the future that can take depleted uranium, use that, and actually breed new fuel for the next reactor, or to refuel themselves. And so getting rid of waste, getting rid of nuclear waste through generating power, those are the technologies coming forward.
Another question from the audience. Someone shared an article today which highlighted high losses in transmission and distribution, negating any benefit to cheaper energy generation, including the loss of expensive resources like treated water. Should we not look holistically at power evacuation and transmission and distribution with power generation? Rob, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I did touch on this a little bit earlier. I think there's still very much a role for transmission, especially even HVDC transmission, because we can't generate, even through solar and even through wind, electricity in every place around a particular country or continent. We're just going to have to pick those places where it's most feasible to do so. And in, let's say, an example of the U.S., a lot of the solar right now is generated in my home state, North Carolina, is certainly one of the top states, California, Arizona. But not every state has the ability to generate economically a large volume of solar-driven kind of energy, as one example. So therefore, why not make our investments in places where that energy is generated more economically and to be able to provide the societal benefit we need by being efficiently spending our capital and then transmitting that power through transmission distribution systems in order to get it to the loads and the buildings that need it the most. And, yes, we're going to have some losses even as we invest in long distance HVDC. But, the point being is that it's still, as we look at the system holistically, it's more economic to do this on a central basis with utility scale systems. However, there's also the notion that certain customers want to actually take fuller control of their energy supply and their storage and their use, and to be able to generate directly on site. Why not? Give them the opportunity to have that flexibility, whether it's through a microgrid or to be able to control their personal environmental footprint as it relates to the way that they supply and consume electricity. And so, there's going to be a portfolio approach that really applies here for many years to come. So I would never want to discount the notion that we're still going to invest pretty heavily in transmission and distribution infrastructure. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, this may, at least in the US, once again, be a record year for capital spending all across the value chain for power companies. In particular, transmission and distribution are getting an even greater share of capital spending than they have in recent years.
Absolutely. And according to our strategic directions report, a lot of the industry leaders concluded that they'll also continue to have that large capital expenditure in the transmission and distribution business here over the next several years as well. Regarding the current times that we're in, the unprecedented times, Deepa, could you talk a little bit about investment uncertainty for utilities?
Absolutely. As we've talked about here this hour, this is, even just set aside the pandemic, this is a period of significant transformation for the electric industry. The advent of renewables, the more distributed nature of energy resources, and moving away from centralized generation to a much, much more distributed infrastructure, is driving changes in many different aspects. One of the sort of opportunities as well as challenges that this provides utilities is that significant investment is needed to bring all of this these distributed energy resources into the electric grid and connect your supply to your demand. Even as the regulatory frameworks are still being defined, so this is all happening in real time. Like somebody said earlier, you're trying to lay the tracks even as the train is coming. So there's definitely a lot of uncertainty around that, which presents a challenge for investments. In the SDR survey, 40% of our respondents said that recovery of infrastructure investments to modernize the grid is a concern and one of the uncertainties that they worry about. Another 40% said that recovery of operating costs and ability to provide satisfactory earnings is another significant uncertainty that they deal with. So, in this environment where the regulatory framework isn't quite defined yet, but the infrastructure investment that is needed is very large. It's a very dynamic and challenging environment for utilities. They're dealing with rate fatigue. They're dealing with a higher bar in terms of needing to prove the value of these investments. Much more rigorous cost-benefit analysis is needed. Much more analysis and tracking is needed to demonstrate that the value that they had attached to some of these investments is in fact being realized after the fact. So, this is all additional scrutiny, additional burden of proof that utilities are having to address in this new investment environment.
Absolutely, Deepa. And to your point, we are in the phase of a very transformative market at the time, regardless if we were in a pandemic or not. So I think that really adding the layer of the pandemic in addition creates a very interesting place for our utilities to be in. Rob, I have some feelings you have thoughts about this question as well. What are you thinking about uncertainty and investments?
Well, if you get past the points that Deepa just raised, and a project is funded and it's viable, even the certain projects of the past are even more uncertain today during the pandemic situation. And let me talk about a couple of factors that come in there. One is simply just getting all the approvals and permitting you need up front. A lot of municipalities and governmental jurisdictions just don't have the staffing or the capability these days and the capacity to be able to provide a more timely response to requirements for permitting, whether you're crossing roads or railroad tracks or building in greenfield or brownfield development areas. So that's one that we have to deal with. The other is supply chain issues. I mean, just simply having manufacturers being able to deliver on a timely manner the components, the equipment, the supplies, the tools, everything that you need in order to build some of these projects. And so those are things that require additional contingencies as well. And then finally, once you're on site and ready to begin a project, whether it's a large scale solar farm or a solar plus storage, whatever the facility is, then you have the uncertainty about maintaining the safety of your craft workers and your crews, in order to make sure that everyone shows up healthy, that infections for COVID-19 are kept at bay as much as possible and we're tested and screened in advance. And then you also have to be thinking about the contingency of backup crews and craft in order to replace those who might temporarily be out of work for whatever reason. And so all of these contingencies even come in during certain times and certain types of projects. And we have to be thinking, and we do think about these very often in order to have backup plans of action and contingencies to deal with them. So even the certainty part of this industry is not as certain as it used to be.
Absolutely. Rob, I'm going to give you the last question of the day to kind of close us out on this live Q&A session. But how will emerging technologies impact the power generation mix going forward? I know that we've talked a lot about emerging technologies, but from a higher level, what are some of the major impacts that we're going to be seeing?
Well, we talked about some of the central generation technologies. We talked about the nuclear side and hydro, but I think about the capacity that we're going to be retiring in terms of future coal plants that will be retired. And a lot of that capacity will not be built like for like. It'll be replaced with distributed energy resources. And depending on which research projection you believe, we're going to see at least a 3 to 4 fold increase in distributed energy resource capacity, at least in North America and in many places around the world, over just the next decade. And so we're going to be seeing significant increases in electric vehicle charging capacity, as well as the inherent storage capacity of the batteries on those vehicles. We're going to see significant increase in distributed solar and storage, battery energy storage systems, and the combination of those two technologies. And we're certainly going to have some greater flexibility in terms of how we allow consumers, the consumer-owned portions of DERs, to be economically justified and enable those consumers to gain some monetary value from using those distributed energy resources. But there's also the question of visibility. Will utilities have complete visibility to those resources that are available behind the meter, especially? And in a lot of cases, that's not appearing to be the case. So we need to make sure that we are properly addressing this significant growth in distributed energy resources and in the resource planning that is taking place on behalf of utilities today. And in fact, that is, in my view, one of the biggest drivers for the increase in capital spending that's being applied to distribution systems today, in addition to concerns around resiliency and reliability.
The transformation in the power industry is really just getting started, isn't it? It'll be interesting to see how the market will evolve over the next several years. And I have to say, it's an exciting time to be involved in the power industry. But that's all the time we have set aside for today. Thank you to all of our panelists, Deepa, Rob, Jason, for joining us. If you weren't able to get your question answered in our session today, we'll do our best to follow up with you individually within the next week. And just a reminder, you can download our full report findings at bv.com/reports. If you'd like a one-on-one with any of our panelists today, please visit us at bv.com/experts. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.